Why isn't it wrong for people in extreme poverty to have kids? Best way to reduce birth rate is to increase education and standard of living. Edit. Jumping to the top to comment on some ideas floating around below. Namely, poor people should not have kids they can't afford, or they have to prove their ability before getting pregnant. That is fucked. No matter where you're born, what possessions you do or don't have, or how rich or poor your parents were. Everyone, every single living being, deserves the autonomy to call the shots for their own body. Piercings, abortions, tattoos, sex reassignment, and yes, making babies. This is a right of existing above government and systems of commerce. This is being human. Having an income bracket to make babies is a quick slide into some Handmaid's Take fuckery. I ain't having it. I'll keep it short. Human beings, being animals, are not gonna stop fucking. Ever. Poor people have less access to sexual education, low cost or free birth control resources, pre- and postnatal care, and abortions. Therefore, they make more babies. When you have options, or feel like you have options, you use them. Some poor people don't have the knowledge or the options, so they get babies. Poor people need either free comprehensive healthcare including sex and birth-related coverage, and/or access to Planned Parenthood and sex education. There really is only one political party that thinks this is a bad idea. And they are the same ones complaining about poor people making babies. I guess I wasn't that short. Universal human rights should be universal. If you start making exceptions and cutting tips on who is eligible to be forcefully castrated, there will always be people trying to further in the line. Also, in most cases, poverty isn't a permanent disability state. It's something a barely competent state could and should at least ease. My family has never had a dime to spare after rent every month, and I wonder the same thing. So, first off, I'd point out that you're almost certainly descended from people who spent their entire lives in conditions of absolute poverty. I don't know how many generations you'd need to go back in your particular case. But somewhere in your family tree there are subsistence farmers and hunter-gatherers who led incredibly painful lives and probably buried a lot of their kids. The only reason you're around to ask this question is because they did it against the odds for generation after generation. Second, having kids isn't always a decision. Women get sexually assaulted. Sex education can be non-existent, and access to contraception and safe abortion likewise. Third, even someone born with a silver spoon in their mouth has no guarantee of living in prosperity forever. Nor is someone born into poverty necessarily going to have a life not worth living or never make a name for themselves. On the contrary, go to the biographical section of pretty much any bookshop and you'll find rows and rows of insane stories about people who overcame their difficult childhoods and went on to achieve amazing things, both for themselves and for others. Obviously, in a perfect world, child poverty wouldn't exist. And it's an absolute national disgrace that it exists at the levels it does even in supposedly prosperous countries. But it isn't the fault of ordinary people, who since the year have done what nature has programmed them to do and made babies. It's the fault of an inhuman system which treats human lives as means to an end rather than ends in themselves, and finds ever more obscene ways to justify the yawning gaps in health, wealth and opportunity at birth. Know how sometimes you've had a terrible day and just go to bed early so you can try again? Some people do that with generations. If your life is screwed already, massive debt, no employment options, etc., Sometimes the only ray of hope is that you could have a kid who makes something of themselves. It's basic human nature to want to leave your influence in the world. If you don't have a fulfilling life in other ways, may as well try having a kid. Related. Sometimes people make bad decisions. Also, sex feels good. In the US, it's largely a result of lack of access to sexual health resources and a general lack of comprehensive sexual education. It's not that women experiencing inescapable poverty are like, you know what would be great? Putting my life at risk, birth a child. Maternal mortality rates are exceptionally high in the US among women in poverty. It's that people in poverty experience the same urges as most other humans to have sex and ultimately raise a child. But they don't have access to the healthcare or childcare that would allow them to plan a family without remaining in deep poverty. So a child becomes the punishment for having sex and a burden keeping them impoverished instead of a planned life event. Why isn't it wrong that we allow children to grow up in extreme poverty when we have more than enough resources to prevent them doing so? Counter. Why isn't it wrong for people to be kept in severe poverty by the economic system? It is wrong. People just hate admitting it. If you can't financially take care of yourself, you have zero reason to add to your financial burdens with a child. I'm not talking about people in regular situations of poverty, for lack of a better term, who can still feed, clothe and educate their kids. I mean people in what seems to be inescapable poverty, who can't even feed themselves. Could you be more specific about who you're talking about exactly? The set of all people in the world who have kids but are struggling to support them is very large and diverse. Some of them were in a better economic position when they had kids. Some have unexpectedly found themselves having to support the kids of relatives who have died or become ill. Some have learning disabilities or severe mental illnesses that make it difficult for them to understand or use contraception, or that have made it more difficult than they expected to look after kids. Some of them live in environments where there isn't widespread access to contraception, abortion, or sex education. Some were pressured or coerced into having kids by other people. And in many parts of the world, there aren't pensions or retirement communities, and the expectation is that your kids will look after you when you're older, in which case poverty is a reason to have kids. My class asked that once philosophy teacher, and he said something like, humans have 5 pillars. The strongest one is the one that includes food, water, and reproductive sex. In cases of poverty, the only thing separating us from a beast is reproduction. I wouldn't be surprised if he was high when he said it, because that was a weird philosophy class. Speaking as a family doctor, most of the pregnancies in young impoverished mums in this area, UK, tend to be people who don't plan life more than 20 minutes ahead and are terrible at contraception. Very few are stable in long-term relationships and making a decision to have a child despite their poverty. There are a couple like that, but they are just really fucking brain dead. Yes, it is. You're sentencing a child to hell at that point. There's a kid in my school who was adopted into a poor family. He sleeps on the floor, uses a sheet for a blanket, and would go around the school asking if students had food, money. It just makes me so angry. Why would you adopt a child when you live in poverty? How do you adopt a child when in poverty? Like, did they just spend their entire life savings on adopting a kid? Why? Why do that? I feel so bad for the dude. Isn't adoption crazy expensive? How did they even manage to do that? Sorry. You failed at capitalism. You don't get to have kids, have a home, have food, have social protections. Quote. Instead of figuring out what we can take away from people who find themselves in dire circumstances, why can't we focus on figuring out how to help them? Seems pretty self-explanatory. If you can't manage to take care of yourself, you probably can't care for someone else, who will rely on you for literally everything. Illiteracy is one very big cause for this. Also, in third world countries, children are seen as a source of income. The more the children, more wages they will generate for the household. Even in minimum wage jobs which require no education, 5 people will be earning more than just 2 people. Also, standards are very different from every person's perspective. You think someone is poor who earns very less. But from perspective of a billionaire, probably you and me are also poor, and what if she holds the same opinion for you? Unfortunately, some people in poverty may have lots of kids despite the child having a poor life, simply for the reason that the parents may receive money from the country's governing body to help raise the child. In reality, most of these parents tend to spend that money on commodities for themselves rather than using it to raise the child. In my circumstances, my stepmother received the money given to help raise me until I was 16. And the entire time she only used it to fuel her terrible nicotine addiction. Poverty and inequity is the issue, not procreation.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.